Prologue. Kartik, a temple servant with a mind made for knowledge, overhears High Priest Hemanth speaking to Prince Aditya in the Imperial Temple Gardens. The priest praises the purity of Princess Malini and asks if Aditya will protect her. Aditya solemnly agrees, declaring it his duty as her brother. Though the words were not meant for him, Kartik is deeply affected by what he hears, feeling a truth resonate within him that he does not yet fully understand. Later, Kartik watches Malini kneeling in the temple hall, placing a garland of jasmine and roses at the feet of the statue of Divyanshi, the greatest of the 5 Mothers of Flame. Though he remains unseen in the shadows, he listens to her whispered prayers, observing her devotion. From that moment, Kartik recognizes Malini as someone extraordinary, a girl of unmatched purity, and unknowingly begins shaping his own fate around her. In Chapter 1, Malini's army is moving toward Dwarali, and she catches her first glimpse of the sea. Her forces, a blend of warriors from Srugna, Sakatan, Alarans, and Dwarali, are united under her command, aiming to unseat her brother Chandra and claim the throne. As Malini reflects on the power she's amassed, she recalls the carefully plotted journey and the loyalty she's earned. She muses on the sea's symbolism and the powerful rise of her army, yet she is reminded of the absence of her heart-sisters, Alori and Narina. Later, in a tent, Malini receives word from a messenger that Ahiranya now has new rulers, temple elders, including 2 women, one of whom might have been the regent's wife. Malini writes letters to solidify political alliances with Ahiranya while secretly composing a personal letter to Priya, reflecting on their shared history. In Chapter 2, Priya embraces her connection to Ahiranya's land, feeling its magical song guide her. While walking with Seema, Priya wears the attire of a temple elder, a symbol of leadership for the new order in Ahiranya. They and their companions, ex-rebels and soldiers, set out to hunt imperial soldiers. The fight is brutal, with Priya using her powers to subdue most, but one soldier gets an arrow through the throat from Seema. Afterward, Priya reflects on her new role and responsibilities, balancing fear and power. As they return to the Mahal, Priya receives news from Rook that Bhumika has a letter for her from Empress Malini. The letter, full of personal memories and shared history, moves Priya deeply. Despite knowing she shouldn't respond, Priya feels compelled to write back, beginning with, "I miss you," as a quiet rebellion against the distance between them. In Chapter 3, Malini receives Deepa, a shy and plain girl from Lord Mahesh, who wishes to offer her as an assistant. Despite Deepa's lack of remarkable skills, Malini assigns her to assist Lada with scholarly tasks. Malini reflects on the absence of a proper court and the need to build alliances with ambitious women. Malini then meets Lady Razia, the wife of Lord Khalil, who offers to join Malini's cause, citing her ambition and desire for power. Razia's knowledge of politics and war makes her a valuable ally, though Malini recognizes Razia's hunger for more power, particularly for her husband. Malini promises Razia a reward once she secures the empire. Later, Malini receives a letter from Priya, expressing fondness and a lingering connection despite the distance between them. Malini feels both tenderness and longing for Priya, acknowledging the deep bond they share. In Chapter 4, Chandra, consumed by anger and a belief in his right to rule, continues his destructive campaign against his sister Malini, whom he sees as a disgrace. He builds pyres for his enemies, watching flowers of fire bloom as proof of his power. Despite his rage, Chandra seeks guidance from the High Priest, who emphasizes that Malini must burn to purify herself and fulfill her destiny, as the Mothers of Flame did. Chandra struggles with the emotional cost of this, recalling his sister's defiance and rejecting any plea for her to burn willingly. The High Priest reassures him that Malini's sacrifice would offer a different kind of power, one he needs to change the Empire. Chandra, in his desperation, and driven by his conviction that the throne is rightfully his, pledges to continue his path, and the High Priest, ever supportive, promises to stand by him. In Chapter 5, Malini's army faces challenges as the rains delay their progress. During the pause, she writes unspoken letters to Priya, reflecting on their bond and her deep desire to know Priya's heart. Malini's strategic maneuvering continues as she wins allies and forces her enemies, including Chandra's supporters, to submit. She also handles internal conflict, dealing with Lord Rohit's defiance and the difficult dynamics among her allies. As her forces march toward Saketa, Malini senses something wrong. The High Prince's lack of an official reception raises suspicions, and a strange priest's warning indicates something deeper is afoot. Malini realizes that a deadly trap has been set, involving the sacred fire of the mothers, and her army is soon engulfed in chaos. Despite the threat, Malini remains resolute, commanding her retreat and organizing her forces amidst the devastating attack, while reflecting on her leadership and the sacrifices she must make. In Chapter 6, Priya struggles with the formalities of her role as an elder, wishing to be more authentic and less of a symbol. She arrives in a village suffering from the rot, and alongside Ganem works to contain its spread. Priya uses her thrice-born powers to heal a girl infected with the rot, but the field remains beyond her control. Despite the success in saving the girl, the rot will continue to affect the village. Priya grapples with her limitations and the immense responsibility she feels. Later, in a moment of vulnerability with Seema, Priya admits that she has written to Malini, though she is unsure where they stand. Seema expresses a desire to be more, hinting at joining the thrice-born, but Priya warns her against the heavy cost of such power. The chapter concludes with Priya contemplating the sacrifices she's made and the lingering presence of the waters in her life. In Chapter 7, Malini returns to camp shaken by the aftermath of the battle, haunted by the memories of burning women and her heart-sisters, Alori and Narina. She regains her composure with Razia's help, and soon confronts Lord Mahesh about his failure to sound the retreat when their army was at risk. Mahesh argues that Malini's decision to retreat will be seen as a sign of weakness, but she asserts her right to protect her men. Malini later meets with Deepa, who admits that her father sent her to serve Malini, but that she wants more: power and protection for her family. Malini offers her the chance to help bring down her father's power in exchange for loyalty. Malini reflects on the burdens of power and her desire to control her fate, leading her to write a letter to Priya, though she struggles to separate her personal feelings from her role as Empress. In Chapter 8, Rao arrives at the War Council late, where chaos ensues, with Lord Mahesh claiming Malini is too overwhelmed to attend. Rao tries to defend Malini, but holds back after receiving a silent warning from Lord Khalil. He later confronts Malini about a secret message she sent to Ahiranya, though she refuses to disclose its contents. Tension builds as Rao advises her against reaching out to Ahiranya during such volatile times, but Malini is firm in her decision. Rao, burdened with loyalty and frustration, reflects on his ties to Aditya and his role in Malini's rise. Seeking solace, he visits Aditya's tent, where the two discuss their past, Chandra's actions, and their complicated relationship. Aditya expresses a desire to forgive his brother, though Rao struggles with the grief of losing his sister Alori. Aditya asks Rao to assess his guards, and the chapter ends with a lingering sense of unresolved tension. In Chapter 9, Bhumika, the High Elder of Ahiranya, begins her day with a ritualistic reverence, donning the sacred crown mask imbued with powerful magic. She feels the weight of leadership as she ascends the Hirana, the mountain temple, to meet the worshippers, reflecting on the changes she's made in the temple. Afterward, she spends time with her daughter Padma and contemplates the political challenges she faces. Lord Chaitan, a highborn of Ahiranya, arrives to express concerns over food shortages and trade issues, suggesting that Ahiranya should rejoin the Parijatdvipa Empire. Bhumika rejects this idea, emphasizing self-reliance, and urges him to remain loyal to the Temple Council. Bhumika then discusses the growing restlessness of the Mask Keepers, hinting at the potential necessity of allowing more people to pass through the deathless waters. As the chapter closes, Bhumika receives an urgent message from Empress Malini, summoning Priya. In Chapter 10, Kunal and his sister Varsha arrive in Parijat, where they are introduced to the cold city and its people. A priest named Kartik from Saketa guides them around, offering a meal and sharing insights about his temple. Kunal reflects on his father's orders, preparing his sister for her marriage to Emperor Chandra, which was arranged to secure an alliance and ensure food supplies for Saketa. Though Varsha questions whether she'll be happy, Kunal assures her she will be. On the wedding day, Kunal meets with the Emperor, who discusses the strategic importance of the marriage and the need for Saketa's full support in the war against the false Empress. Kunal realizes the cost of this alliance, understanding that while the Emperor promises support, his true intentions may be more self-serving. He watches Varsha marry, fearing for his family's future and the inevitable death that looms over them. In Chapter 11, Priya reads a letter from Malini, who is in danger, and discusses it with Bhumika. The letter mentions a green-sabred warrior and a false weapon that could lead to ruin. Priya is unsure of how to help Malini but recognizes her power, especially in terms of ancient magic. Bhumika urges Priya to go as Malini needs her strength. Priya, feeling torn, is reluctant to leave Ahiranya, but Bhumika insists on the importance of their alliance with Malini. Priya struggles with her responsibility to Ahiranya and the risks of the mission. She agrees to go and prepares to leave, packing and saying goodbye to friends like Bilu, Rook, and Seema. Seema hesitates but eventually agrees to accompany Priya. Priya leaves with uncertainty, but determined to fulfill her role for both Ahiranya and Malini's cause. In Chapter 12, Parul, a palace servant, reflects on the skill of staying unnoticed in the Imperial Mahal. She remembers her mother's lessons on being efficient without drawing attention. After a celebration, Parul, slightly drunk, carelessly walks through the main corridors instead of the servants' areas, where she accidentally comes across two priests discussing the emperor. One priest, Kartik, speaks cryptically about a plan to protect Parijatdvipa and mentions a mother-blessed path if the emperor does not listen to his priests. Fearing discovery, Parul hides in the shadows, holding her breath. After a tense moment, the priests leave and she escapes unnoticed. Grateful for her luck, Parul realizes she has narrowly avoided a potentially fatal situation and vows to remain hidden as her survival depends on remaining out of sight. In Chapter 13, Malini's council discusses the siege of Saketa, with Mahesh proposing a starvation strategy. However, Malini questions the viability of the plan, highlighting their own supply issues. Lada, a sage, warns that Saketa's maze fort is impenetrable, and Mahesh argues that the High Prince must be neutralized before they move against Malini's brother. Malini realizes Mahesh's loyalty to her is weakening, and he may want to replace her with Aditya. Later, Malini visits her brother Aditya, where she learns Mahesh has approached him about taking the throne. Malini, sensing Mahesh's waning faith in her, tries to regain his support. The chapter shifts to a funerary tent, where Malini inspects the body of a priest who died saving her. She uncovers his mysterious tattoos and questions a priest about his training. Malini grows suspicious, believing the priest's actions were orchestrated by someone higher up in the temple. In Chapter 14, a priest is reborn from the deathless waters beneath the Hirana. Slowly, they gain control over their body, learning to breathe and move, their reflection showing a blank, emotionless face. As they rise, they sense the land is familiar and their own creation. Walking through a vibrant city, the reborn figure is drawn by a force, moving through the forest until reaching an ancient tree. There, buried under a mass of rot, lies a woman, Sanjana, once thought dead after being murdered and set alight. The reborn figure calls her name, and she awakens, her form briefly shifting to wood before returning to her human shape. Together they prepare to find others, sensing a larger purpose awaiting them. In Chapter 15, Duren lives in isolation, his family having perished from the rot that infected the lake behind his home. Once a prosperous fishing spot, the lake is now useless, with the rot spreading to Duren and his family. Only Duren remains, visited occasionally by a boy named Anil, who brings food and helps with repairs. One day, while Anil works to fix a mosquito net, he senses something approaching the lake. Duren, despite his pain, is drawn outside and sees two figures standing by the water. One is a woman, inhuman and ancient, who calls him a worshipper. She, along with the male figure, invites him to follow them into the forest, and he obeys. As Duren walks away, Anil, now infected with the rot, watches in fear, but Duren doesn't look back, following the beings into the darkness. In Chapter 16, Bhumika struggles with the departure of her sister Priya, who leaves for an uncertain mission. Bhumika, feeling anxious and unwell, spends her days seeking comfort in ritual and conversation with Kritika, who voices her frustration over Bhumika's cautious leadership. Bhumika allows some mask keepers to pass through the deathless waters despite the risks. Meanwhile, Bhumika grows increasingly concerned for Priya's well-being, eventually sending for a rider to check on her. The mask keepers perform a ritual as part of their transition, and Bhumika reflects on the weight of leadership and the costs of survival. As the day draws on, Bhumika experiences a disturbing vision, feeling the presence of something unnatural. She goes outside to find pilgrims surrounding her home, led by a figure she recognizes, Ashok, her dead brother, returned with others, including her deceased siblings. The reunion is marked by unnatural growth and magic, unsettling Bhumika deeply. In Chapter 17, Priya, traveling with Yogesh and Seema, struggles with the growing distance from Bhumika and the unsettling loss of her connection to Ahiranya. She worries about the safety of her people and her inability to reach the Sangam. When they encounter a rotting village, Priya uses her power to stop the rot, feeling reassured that her magic still works. However, she remains uncertain about her abilities beyond Ahiranya. As they approach Cicada, Priya faces the reality of her strained relationship with Malini. Malini arrives, and the two share a tense yet intimate moment discussing their loyalty and the complexities of their political roles. Priya, now in the position of Ahiranya's representative, tries to maintain control and composure. She bows before Malini, acknowledging her role, while Malini, now Empress, greets her with a distant formal welcome. The tension between personal feelings and duty grows. In Chapter 18, Malini faces internal resistance about bringing Priya to Cicada as Mahesh and other highborn question the inclusion of an Ahiranya elder. Despite their concerns, Malini insists on Priya's value and loyalty, asserting that she will prove her commitment. To solidify this, Malini arranges for Priya to demonstrate her loyalty at a temple of the Faceless Mother, despite the tension around her presence. During the temple visit, Malini and Priya share a private moment where Malini expresses her longing, though both are conscious of the political stakes. Priya bows in the temple, reaffirming her loyalty, but Malini's actions are driven by deeper intentions. She receives a mysterious gift from a priest who claims to have been loyal to her cause. The fire contained in the gift reveals that Chandra's power is not truly blessed, confirming Malini's suspicions and bolstering her resolve to act. In Chapter 19, Bhumika welcomes the Yaksa, who have returned to Ahiranya, including one who takes the form of her deceased sister, Sanjana. Despite the Yaksa's power and their connection to her people, Bhumika feels uneasy about their true intentions. The Yaksa express their desire to restore Ahiranya's glory, but Bhumika is wary, recalling the teachings of the birch bark mantras. While some, like Kritika, embrace the return of the Yaksa as a miracle, Bhumika remains cautious. She quietly warns her trusted allies not to fully trust the Yaksa, recognizing the difference between their mortal form and their true power. Tensions rise as Rook mentions Ashok's behavior, noting something feels off about him. The chapter ends with a tragic discovery. A rider Bhumika sent to Priya is found dead, signaling a dire message and leaving Bhumika powerless to protect those she loves. Priya is now beyond her reach. In Chapter 20, Priya's camp is set up in a poor location far from the war council, reflecting the tension between Ahiranya and Parijatdvipan soldiers. Priya grapples with the aftermath of bowing to the Mothers of Flame, a political act that makes her question her loyalty to Ahiranya versus Malini. She seeks answers from the Sangam but is frustrated when Bhumika doesn't respond. Priya attends a meeting called by Lada with highborn women, where Lady Razia challenges her to demonstrate her strength. Priya deflects by emphasizing her loyalty to Malini and suggesting Seema demonstrate her archery skills. After a tense archery game, a confrontation occurs when a Sakadan soldier insults Seema. Priya intervenes, warning the soldier, but he spits in her face. In a fit of anger, Priya uses her magic to summon the earth to strike the soldier, making a bold statement of power before being restrained and dragged away. In Chapter 21, Malini's camp grows increasingly restless during the siege, and she is approached by Prince Ashutosh, who brings Priya in chains, accusing her of attacking his men with magic. Ashutosh demands her punishment, and tensions rise as he calls Priya a monster for using witchcraft. Malini defends Priya, asserting that the Ahiranyi have sworn loyalty to her and that Priya's powers serve the empire. After some negotiation, Malini offers Ashutosh the choice of a financial redress or a public caning for Priya. Ashutosh demands the lives of his men be saved instead. Malini forces Ashutosh to acknowledge his men's role in the conflict and allows Priya to heal them, putting an end to the dispute. She also orders that one of Ashutosh's soldiers be punished for initiating the conflict. Priya vows to not repeat the incident. In Chapter 22, Rao visits a makeshift shrine to the nameless god in the camp, seeking solace. He is joined by Lada, who finds him alone and contemplative. They discuss his growing sense of loss and aimlessness, with Lada suggesting that Rao seek guidance from the nameless god or one of his priests. Rao admits that he no longer feels connected to the god and is unsure of his purpose after giving his name to the Empress. Lada encourages him to ask Aditya, as she believes he holds the answers Rao seeks. Rao is left to ponder whether seeking purpose from Aditya could provide him the direction he desires. He reflects on his need for clarity and guidance, and humorously requests that next time, Lada simply get him drunk instead. In Chapter 23, Priya is tasked with helping soldiers suffering from the rot despite their distrust of her. She offers her healing, but is met with reluctance. When the camp erupts into chaos as the fortress gates open, Priya realizes a battle is imminent. She tries to act as a calm leader, directing her men to wait, but when flames shoot toward them, she uses her powers to stop the fire, only for it to overwhelm her. She collapses, feeling her magic hindered by the unnatural fire. She is later found in the Sangam by Bhumika, who heals her wound in a way that feels wrong and unsettling. Priya's body is restored, but she realizes that relying on Bhumika's aid is dangerous as it may not be sustainable. Priya fears the fire's ability to destroy her magic, and with it, Ahiranya itself. In Chapter 24, Deepa is in her father's tent, trying to cope with the chaos and the fires engulfing the camp. She struggles with her fear, unable to escape the looming danger. Lada enters and, with a stern tone, reminds Deepa to compose herself. Lada informs Deepa that her father has failed in his duties by ordering the siege against the Empress's judgment, leading to deaths. Lada gives Deepa a choice: stand by her father or remain loyal to the Empress. Deepa, recalling all the secrets she's uncovered about her father's actions, affirms her loyalty to the Empress. She resolves to make a path for herself, choosing to remain steadfast in her loyalty and commit to the Empress's cause, despite the personal consequences. She seeks to carve out a future for herself, no longer invisible and always loyal to the Empress. In Chapter 25, Ashok is struggling to adjust to his return, feeling disconnected and numb. Despite being reunited with Bhumika and the Mask Keepers, he finds himself disconnected from his humanity. He seeks solace in an orchard where he is approached by Sanjana, a yaksa, who speaks of the yaksa's origins and the sacrifices made to become part of the world. She tells him that the yaksa are now bound to flesh, wearing human bodies. Ashok is disturbed, but Sanjana dismisses his concerns, explaining that the rot, which causes death, is just a form of new life to them. Ashok grapples with his existence, feeling torn and detached from his former self. Ganam later approaches him, expressing relief at his return and frustration at the current state of things. Ashok is uncertain of his own desires and decides he needs time alone, feeling disconnected from his past and his future. In Chapter 26, Malini confronts Lord Mahesh, who is responsible for a failed siege that resulted in many deaths. Despite his past service, she strips him of his title as general, acknowledging his mistakes while showing mercy. She offers him the chance to redeem himself, but makes it clear that his failures have led to his downfall. Afterward, Malini announces her decision to move forward, vowing to march on Parijat. Amid tensions, Prince Aditya steps forward and volunteers to take on the risky mission to help win the war. Malini struggles with this decision, but ultimately agrees. She establishes a new council of generals, choosing key leaders from different nations. Among them is Lord Narayan and Lord Prakash, while Prince Rao from Alor also accepts. Malini offers no such position to Priya, though their eyes meet, filled with unspoken understanding and gratitude. In Chapter 27, Rao confronts Aditya about his decision to lead the army, believing it to be reckless and dangerous given the power of the High Prince's forces. Aditya, however, is determined to take on the responsibility, trusting in the will of the nameless god. They engage in a sparring match where Aditya shows surprising skill despite his time away from battle. Rao challenges Aditya's calm approach, but Aditya counters that his honor is guided by the nameless and his heart, not by old rules of war. After a playful but intense fight, they reconcile, and Rao acknowledges Aditya's ability to still wield a sword effectively. Aditya asks Rao to protect the Empress, and they share a moment of renewed camaraderie. As they part, Aditya reveals a dream in which he saw Rao's eyes shining like stars, hinting at a deeper connection yet to be understood. In Chapter 28, Bhumika observes the growing influence of the Yaksa, who are revered by the people of Ahiranya. They heal the rot, but demand offerings in return. Bhumika is disturbed by the Yaksa's practices, especially when Chandni stops a woman's rot in exchange for future offerings, including her child. This prompts Bhumika to reflect on Priya's own actions with the rot and her own sense of duty to protect Ahiranya. Bhumika learns that no one can leave Ahiranya, and the Yaksa are hiding their existence from the outside world. She orders the borders to be closed to prevent anyone from fleeing or entering. Later, Bhumika visits a library to seek knowledge, and a strange image in a scroll unsettles her. That night, she is drawn to her daughter's room where she finds the Yaksa holding Padma. Bhumika is forced to submit to their control, as the Yaksa demand trust in their care of her child. In Chapter 29, Ganam reflects on the unpredictability of life, from fighting for a free country to dealing with the return of the Yaksa and the resurrection of the man he once followed. He makes his way to Elder Bhumika's study to discuss Rook's reckless behavior. When he peers inside, he finds Bhumika distraught, held by Jivan as she sobs over the fate of her daughter Padma. Ganam retreats, shocked and worried about Padma's safety. He later learns from Kalita that Bhumika had sent her away, and mothers are being torn from their children. This injustice reignites Ganam's anger, and he vows to rescue Padma, promising Kalita that he will keep her safe, no matter how long it takes. In Chapter 30, Ashok, now back from the dead, reflects on the worsening rot in Ahiranya and his connection to the Yaksa. After a conversation with Ganam about the spreading rot and growing worship of the Yaksa, Ashok confronts a young boy, Rook, who has been spying on the Yaksa. Ashok uses his power to extract the magic embedded in Rook, weakening him and leaving him hollow. Rook tries to resist, but eventually reveals his knowledge of Ashok's true identity and his betrayal, though he can no longer recall details about Ashok's sister. Ashok, feeling both triumphant and sorrowful, returns Rook to his place under the Yaksa's control. Ashok is now more deeply entwined with the rot and the Yaksa's power, realizing the high cost of his actions and the manipulations of memory and magic. In Chapter 31, Malini, overwhelmed by the demands of her court, seeks a private moment with Priya. She reassures Priya about her losses in the recent attack, offering her a place to stay and support. Their conversation turns more personal, with Priya teasing Malini about their past and Malini expressing her deep affection for her. However, Malini is also strategic, wanting Priya to accompany Rao in future battles as a trusted ally. Meanwhile, Malini discusses the risks of Aditya's involvement in the war with Rao, admitting that she did not plan for him to stay behind, though she acknowledges his desire to protect her. In a tense conversation with her brother, Malini reveals her complex feelings, both love and anger, toward him. She clarifies that she never intended to harm him, but the burden of their past and his choices weighs heavily on her. In Chapter 32, Chandra receives news of his sister Malini's survival and continued leadership. Despite his rage and disappointment, he decides to act swiftly, preparing for her potential approach to Parijat. As he contemplates his sister's defiance and survival, his anger grows. Chandra's advisors suggest strategies to meet Malini's forces, but Chandra's focus is solely on her destruction. His conversation with High Priest Hemant reveals deeper concerns, as rot from Ahiranya spreads to Parijat, threatening the empire. Sushant, a loyal lord, suggests a way to confront Malini, but Chandra's rage blinds him to anything but his sister's demise. In the temple, Chandra demands to know what other dangers face him, revealing the rot's full extent. Hemant's ominous words suggest that the threat is greater than Chandra realizes. Chandra's plan to crush his sister intensifies as he confronts the growing darkness within his empire. In Chapter 33, Bhumika finds Rook in a dire state, suffering from the rot after Ashok's actions. She confronts Ashok in the orchard, demanding to know what he did to the boy. Ashok claims he gave Rook a gift of wisdom, though Bhumika is horrified by his detached response. Ashok reveals he is not fully himself, but a mask created by the Yaksa. Bhumika's fear intensifies as she confronts the Yaksa, represented by one that resembles Chandni. The Yaksa reveal their desire to reshape the world in their image, using war as a tool to expand their influence. Despite Bhumika's resistance and the revulsion she feels, the Yaksa demands her compliance. She is coerced into organizing a feast for the highborn to celebrate their return, marking another step in the Yaksa's dominance over Ahiranya. Bhumika reluctantly agrees, knowing she is bound to them. In Chapter 34, Swati, responsible for overseeing the Empress's possessions during their journey, is interrupted by an archer named Dwarali, who invites her to watch a training session with Lady Razia's women. Swati is reluctant, but follows out of curiosity. The group is practicing archery, and Swati hesitates, feeling out of place. However, Seema, an Ahiranya advisor, offers to teach her the basics, assuring her that she is a kinder teacher than Sahar. Swati is initially shy, but Seema convinces her that learning a new skill, even something small like archery, could be empowering in the midst of war. Swati agrees to give it a try, realizing the value of gaining power even if it's fragile in these uncertain times. In Chapter 35, Malini's army reaches the edge of Parijat, facing a critical decision on their route. The generals, including Rao, discuss two potential paths to Harsinghar, one through farmland and another along the difficult Veri River. Malini considers using a smaller, less obvious crossing along the Veri, aiming to outflank her brother's forces in a pincer movement. The plan is risky, but Malini's confidence in her allies, particularly Lady Razia's archers, bolsters her resolve. Later, Malini discusses the upcoming battle with Priya, asking her to stay in reserve and use her powers to protect the army if the situation turns dire. Priya agrees, acknowledging her strength despite being far from Ahiranya. The chapter ends with a moment of emotional tension between them, as Malini realizes the depth of her feelings for Priya and asks her to join Rao in the morning to scout the crossing. In Chapter 36, Priya and Seema travel toward a crossing on the Veri River, accompanied by Prince Rao and Low Prince Ashutosh. They find a small, difficult crossing, where Ashutosh's men prepare to cross. Priya senses an ambush waiting on the opposite bank and warns Rao. She suggests retreating to mislead the enemy and then crossing unexpectedly. As arrows rain down, Priya uses her magic to create an opportunity for the army to cross by controlling the river. She faces immense pain, but manages to manipulate the water, making it part and form a bridge for the army. However, the magic takes a toll and Priya collapses. She vows to the Yaksa, who has been manipulating her, to continue using her power to aid Malini's forces. The chapter ends with Priya letting go of her magic and falling, her strength drained, but the battle's outcome in her hands. In Chapter 37, Malini faces Chandra's large army across the Veri. Although her forces are smaller, she plans to use surprise to her advantage, having sent her men to cross the river and attack Chandra's forces from behind. As arrows rain down on her soldiers, Malini remains resolute, convinced her plan will succeed despite the heavy losses. She debates retreating, but ultimately decides to trust her men and her gambit. While Chandra's forces focus on the ford, Malini prepares for a pincer attack. Suddenly, a massive wave rises from the river, sweeping over Chandra's army and killing many soldiers. Malini realizes Priya has used her power to turn the tide in their favor. The wave creates a bridge, allowing her forces to advance. With renewed hope, Malini leads her army forward, rallying them with a cry of victory as Chandra's forces falter in the face of this unexpected turn. In Chapter 38, Rao leads a charge into battle after the water rises unexpectedly, forming a bridge for Malini's forces. He works with Seema to defeat Chandra's army, crushing them between their own forces and Malini's. After the battle, Rao searches for Priya, who has mysteriously vanished into the water. Despite the belief that she is dead, Rao's determination leads him to find her submerged, surrounded by unnatural flowers. He rescues her, though she appears to be altered by the experience, her body marked with green and flowers. He takes her to Malini, who immediately commands care for Priya. Malini's reaction is one of intense concern, and she orders Priya to rest, showing tenderness despite her usual composure. Rao leaves them, wary of the uncertain nature of Priya's power and the potential consequences for their future. In Chapter 39, Malini tends to Priya, who is recovering after using her magic to win the battle. Priya is weak, her skin still marked by the unnatural magic, and Malini remains at her side, urging her to regain her human form. Priya, feeling the weight of her powers, expresses guilt and uncertainty about her feelings for Malini, admitting that she might be losing herself. Despite Malini's reassurance, Priya struggles with the consequences of her power. They share a tender moment, with Priya revealing her love for Malini, though Malini hesitates to admit her own feelings fully. Priya's magic recedes, leaving her human again, and Malini expresses her hope for a future where they can be together, even as she must return to her duties. The chapter ends with Malini's desire for Priya growing stronger, a force that cannot be stopped. In Chapter 40, Bhumika prepares for a feast, where she confronts Lord Chaitan, who reveals his role in betraying the Ahiranya people under Parijatdvipan rule. Bhumika orders him to show respect to the Yaksa, who will judge him. At the feast, the Yaksa reveal their power, causing the food to rot and people to transform into plants. Bhumika, standing before the Yaksa, understands their intent, to force loyalty through fear and magic. Despite the chaos around her, she bows to the Yaksa, showing her submission and loyalty, leading other highborn to follow her example. The The Yaksa confirm her status as a temple elder, immune to the rot, but demand continued veneration from her people. The scene ends with the highborn lords reluctantly bowing, ensuring their survival at the expense of their autonomy, solidifying the Yaksa's control over Ahiranya. In Chapter 41, Priya struggles with her conflicting emotions between her duties and her bond with Malini. She tries to leave the camp to return home, but is stopped by Seema, who insists that she stay and help secure Ahiranya's future by supporting Malini's rule. After an emotional conversation, Priya agrees, though her desire for Malini remains a strong personal motivator. Priya eventually returns to Malini's tent, where the two share an intimate moment, their bond deepening. As they speak, Priya reflects on her past, particularly the trauma of the fire in Cicada and the scar it left. Malini, understanding Priya's vulnerability, reassures her, and they discuss their futures together. Despite Priya's lingering fears, their connection remains undeniable, leading to a quiet, peaceful intimacy. The chapter closes with Malini's assertion that Priya's presence is the victory she truly sought. In Chapter 42, Bhumika grapples with her grief and the devastating reality of the Yaksa's control over her and her people. She encounters Kritika, who has chosen to worship the Yaksa despite their cruelty, and struggles with the growing division among those who once fought for a better world. Bhumika learns that the Yaksa desire a new age of flowers, manipulating the highborn to aid in their war. She faces the painful truth that her daughter, Padma, is being kept from her, with the Yaksa using her as leverage. As Bhumika contemplates her choices, her brother Ashok, now a Yaksa, offers her forbidden knowledge that could stop the war, but at a great cost, losing herself. Torn between protecting her daughter and risking everything for freedom, Bhumika ultimately decides to act, knowing she cannot do it alone. Javan, a loyal servant, pledges to accompany her, offering his support despite the dangers. In Chapter 43, Malini arrives at a temple surrounded by a barren wasteland, recalling its history from the Book of Mothers. Inside, she meets Kartik, a priest, who once knew her as a child. He reveals that the Yaksa are returning, and Malini's role in the coming war will be crucial. The priest insists she must sacrifice herself willingly, just as the mothers did, to defeat the Yaksa and secure the throne. Malini agrees, vowing to burn for her people if she takes the throne. The priest promises her victory, but warns her of the challenges ahead, including a potential betrayal. Malini must navigate the complex political and spiritual terrain, making difficult choices, including risking Priya's life. Despite her love for Priya, Malini acknowledges that her mission requires her to place the war above all else, including personal relationships, in order to defeat her brother and take the throne. In Chapter 44, Rao watches Priya and Seema at the temple. He is then summoned by Mitul, a priest, who reveals that the Yaksa are not gone, despite Rao's belief. Mitul shows Rao a severed Yaksa limb, claiming it as a message from the nameless god, urging him to follow his instincts. Rao, still unsure, takes the box containing the limb. Outside, he encounters Malini, who questions him about his intentions. He admits that the Yaksa are returning and that he must return to Aditya in Cicada, believing Aditya has a vital role to play. Malini questions if he believes the solution lies with Aditya rather than her, but Rao insists that he must help Aditya. Malini, sensing Rao's determination, grants him permission to leave with only the necessary men. Rao departs, understanding that both he and Malini are being guided by forces beyond their control. In Chapter 45, Malini faces resistance from Razia, who insists on protecting her in battle, but Malini reveals her plan to fight alone to gain the priestess' support, including agreeing to a sacrificial act of burning. Malini admits she lied to the priests, pretending to be willing to die for them to gain their backing. Priya is disturbed by this, but Malini explains that her sacrifice is necessary to win the priest's loyalty and help in the upcoming war. Malini also shares her plan to allow herself to be captured if needed, to protect her army. Priya reluctantly agrees to help, and Malini expresses her faith in Priya's ability to act if she's captured. Priya, though hesitant and anxious, prepares for the battle and asks Seema not to follow her, but Seema insists. Priya also secures armor for Seema from Ashutosh's men. As the army heads toward Harsinghar, Priya knows the stakes are higher than ever. In Chapter 46, Kunal learns from his sister Varsha that the Emperor, Chandra, is withholding critical information about Cicada's siege. Kunal feels compelled to protect his father and leave, but Varsha, now pregnant with Chandra's child, insists that staying and securing her position will benefit Cicada. Despite her protests, Kunal leaves in secret, braving the journey to Cicada. He is stopped by strangers on the road, one of whom recognizes him as Prince Kunal from Cicada. Despite his attempt to deny it, the stranger insists that Kunal is coming with him, revealing his knowledge of Kunal's identity. Kunal is captured, and his escape plan fails. This chapter shifts focus from Kunal's personal struggle with his loyalty to Cicada and his family to the looming danger he faces in the form of the mysterious strangers who thwart his plans. In Chapter 47, Chandra struggles with a recurring dream where he is confronted by women in bridal red, claiming he is not chosen. Despite his faith, they mock him, and the fire he associates with his destiny burns him. His anger and exhaustion grow as his lord urges him to take action against his sister Malini and defend Harsinghar. Chandra refuses, believing his place is at the throne, not on the battlefield. He reminisces about his connection to the mothers whom he believes chose him, and recalls how the high priest Hemant molded his faith. Chandra confesses his fears and doubts to Hemant, but ultimately decides to send his men to capture Malini. He resolves to meet her in battle, convinced that his destiny is to defeat the Yaksa and claim his place as the rightful ruler, despite the doubts plaguing his mind. In Chapter 48, Priya and her companions approach Harsinghar, where they witness the Parijatdvipa army's intimidating presence, surrounded by fire. Priya prepares for battle, focusing on her magic and the seeds she has hidden in the soldier's armor. As the chariot moves closer to the city, they are engulfed in a chaotic battle. Priya uses her magic to summon thorns and roots to attack the enemy, but the fight is overwhelming. She and Seema protect each other as flames and arrows rain down. Priya struggles against the fire, reaching for the green to shield the soldiers and herself. Despite her efforts, a massive explosion forces the chariot to careen out of control, and Priya collapses. She hears a voice from the Yaksa, reminding her of her debt. The chapter ends with Priya succumbing to the overwhelming forces around her, hinting at the Yaksa's involvement in her fate. In Chapter 49, Rao releases Prince Kunal from captivity and offers him food, urging him to drink. Despite Kunal's reluctance, Rao attempts to persuade him to join forces with Empress Malini, suggesting it's the best way for Kunal to secure his future. Kunal eventually agrees, seeing Chandra's flaws. They travel to a fortress, where they are met by Aditya and Mahesh, who are struggling to hold off enemy forces. Aditya expresses exhaustion, and despite the fort's resilience, their resources are running out. Rao reveals a box containing proof of the Yaksa's return, which was intended for Aditya. Aditya, recognizing the significance, vows to win the current battle and then face the greater war ahead. Rao suggests a potential ally for infiltrating the fort, but they need to convince him first. The chapter ends with a sense of uneasy hope as they prepare for the coming conflict. In Chapter 50, Malini arrives at Harsinghar, surrounded by Chandra's forces pressing in on her. Despite the chaos and violence around her, Malini maintains her composure, knowing her fate is uncertain. She orders her chariot to be stopped and willingly faces the impending capture. As Chandra's soldiers close in, she is confronted by her brother, who demands she accept the pyre for forgiveness. Malini refuses, asserting her own power and purity. In a tense moment, Kartik intervenes, placing a sword at Chandra's throat, forcing him to release Malini. The high priest, overcome with emotion, orders Chandra to let her go. Malini, now free but powerless, faces Kartik, who briefly toys with his control over her fate before bowing before her, acknowledging her as Empress. Malini smiles, knowing her path to power is secured as she declares her promise of greatness. In Chapter 51, Priya is confronted by the Yaksa, who reveals the debt Priya owes, claiming her heart. The Yaksa demands Priya's full submission, offering her a knife to carve her heart and complete her transformation into the Yaksa's vessel. Priya, terrified, reflects on the sacrifices she's made for Malini and struggles with the decision. She's told that if she doesn't comply, the Yaksa will destroy her loved ones. Priya feels torn between her love for Malini and the threat to her people, but she realizes she must choose to act. The Yaksa, named Mani Ara, takes control, claiming Priya as her priestess. Priya wakes beneath the earth, realizing she has carried out the transformation. Despite her terror, Priya feels the weight of the knife and knows her path is set. She joins Seema, ready to face what comes next as they return to the battle. In Chapter 52, Bhumika ventures into a forest with Ashok, where she must make a sacrifice to the Yaksa. She writes a letter to Priya, uncertain if she will ever return. Ashok leads her to a bower of bones, a place of magic and death. Bhumika confronts her decision, understanding that true sacrifice is not grand gestures, but fighting even when success seems impossible. She expresses that she's not sacrificing but escaping, and despite her resolve, she weeps. Jivan offers his support, vowing to bring her back when her task is done. After a tender moment with him, Bhumika agrees to proceed with the ritual. In the Sangam, Bhumika becomes bound to the Yaksa, gaining knowledge of their ancient power. She is changed, and when she awakes, she is no longer the same. She asks Jivan to take her to Allure, signaling her transformation and the loss of her former self. In Chapter 53, Rao and Mahesh discuss their next move after Kunal reveals a route into the fortress. Rao is concerned about the risks of sending princes into battle, but Aditya insists on leading the charge. They use Kunal's information to infiltrate the fortress, where they find themselves trapped in a maze of corridors. As they navigate, Aditya reflects on the nature of sacrifice and the fate that has led him here. Aditya reveals he must make a sacrifice to end the war and save his people. Despite Rao's protests, Aditya prepares to sacrifice himself by touching the magical fire in the fortress. As the fire envelops him, Rao is overwhelmed by grief and helplessness. Aditya's sacrifice, marked by the fire, is the culmination of his path, leaving Rao in shock and mourning as he faces the impossible loss. In Chapter 54, Malini's victory over her brother Chandra is complete as he is imprisoned. She has no need to lay siege to Harsinghar, as the priests and their warriors have already pledged loyalty to her. Malini visits Chandra in his luxurious prison cell, intending to make him suffer. She presents him with a slow poison, the needleflower tincture, which will kill him gradually. She details how he will die painfully, slowly losing his strength and dignity in front of the court, his old pride stripped away. Chandra, defiant until the end, mocks her, claiming that she will burn as he had intended, but Malini declares that she will do so for her own glory. She offers him the choice to end his life now with the poison, or endure the slow destruction. She leaves him to decide, knowing her victory is inevitable. In Chapter 55, Chandra struggles with the vial of needleflower, torn between death and life. His thoughts swirl in despair as he reflects on his betrayals, especially Hemant's abandonment. Chandra grapples with the fear of facing the slow death his sister Malini promised him, fearing the mocking and the pain. Ultimately, Chandra decides to end his life with a swift death, pouring the needleflower into his mouth and drinking wine to mask its taste. However, as the poison begins to take effect, Chandra realizes too late that it wasn't needleflower. Vomiting violently, he collapses on the floor and Malini enters. As Chandra reaches for her, barely able to breathe, Malini calmly places her hand over his. She watches as he succumbs to the agony of his own making, surrounded by visions of fire, before she coldly acknowledges his suffering, confirming that the end had come. In Chapter 56, Malini leaves her brother Chandra to die after ensuring his fate with poison. She visits Lada, who has secured Queen Varsha, Chandra's wife. Varsha pleads for mercy, insisting she did no wrong, but Malini dismisses her, distracted by the news from the guards. Chandra is dead by his own hand, poisoned with a vial Malini had planted. Though she is shaken by the confirmation, she feels overwhelming relief. Malini had deceived Chandra, using poison disguised as a painless death. The weight of his death lifts her, and she silently revels in her victory. She instructs Lada to deal with the widow and seeks solitude. As she walks through the palace, the news of Chandra's death spreads, and she is met with respect from her warriors. Alone in her throne room, Malini confronts her emotions, fear, grief, rage, and joy, finally allowing herself to acknowledge her triumph. She has won. In Chapter 57, the celebration after the battle for Harsinghar feels hollow to Priya. She is lost in the revelry, unable to share the joy of victory. Lada informs her that the Empress is safe and victorious, and Priya contemplates a future where Malini rules Parijat while she returns to help Ahiranya. However, the Yaksa's influence looms over her, demanding a terrible sacrifice. Priya plans to betray Malini to save their loved ones, feeling torn between love for Malini and her duty to protect home. Seema, horrified, tries to stop her, but Priya insists, explaining the Yaksa's hold over her. She tells Seema to seek help and protect herself. Priya then finds Malini in the imperial courtroom and, despite the tenderness between them, prepares to cut the needleflower from Malini's throat, apologizing for the betrayal she must commit. Priya's internal conflict culminates in this irreversible act. In Chapter 58, Priya confronts Malini with a desperate, wild look. Priya asks for Malini's trust, revealing that the Yaksa demands she take the needle flower from her throat. As Malini offers it, Priya uses a blade to sever it, but explains it's not her choice. Priya is torn between her love for Malini and her duty to Ahiranya. The two women struggle physically and emotionally, with Priya pressing Malini to take the knife and hollow herself out, while Malini fights back with the intensity of her own feelings. Priya eventually stabs Malini, though she tries not to kill her. As Priya sobs, she tries to convince herself that severing their bond has to be enough. Malini, wounded and betrayed, swears she'll never forgive Priya. Priya walks away, leaving behind a trail of flowers, leaving Malini bleeding but alive, her heart broken by the betrayal. In Chapter 59, Ashok returns to the Mahal, feeling disconnected from his surroundings and his fading self. He picks up Padma, Bhumika's child, and carries her away, reflecting on her potential and his lack of attachment. In the infirmary, he encounters Rukh, who hesitates before taking Padma into his arms, now responsible for her survival. Ashok warns him to protect her, as her life is in Rukh's hands. Ashok, feeling himself fade, leaves Rukh with the child and encounters Sanjana, the Yaksa. She taunts him for betraying his past, manipulating him as his form shifts, becoming more like the Yaksa. She reminds him of his history with the temple children and his inevitable transformation. As Ashok loses his human identity, Sanjana names him Arali, and he acknowledges his new self, fully embracing his transformation into something other than human. In Chapter 60, Malini lies bleeding, her life fading after Priya's betrayal. Despite the pain, she resolves not to die, reflecting on her past and the cost of her ambition. Kartik arrives and informs her that the Yaksa had always intended for her death, and she must choose to burn before she dies. Malini, torn by her circumstances, agrees to sacrifice herself for Parijatdvipa. However, when Kartik attempts to help her, Malini kills him with the thorn blade, rejecting the priest's faith and asserting her own agency. She refuses to be bound by the faith others imposed on her. Malini crawls toward the court doors, determined to survive, and screams for help. Lord Khalil and others arrive, and Malini lies, claiming Kartik tried to protect her. Despite her injuries, Malini is carried away, still clinging to her goal of surviving and securing the Empire's future against the Yaksa's threat. In Chapter 61, Malini wakes in pain, surprised to be alive after her near-death experience. Rao is by her side, but the grief of losing Priya hangs heavy on her heart. Rao tells her that she has been unconscious for weeks, with generals running the city in her absence. He hesitates, then reveals that her brother is dead. Not just Chandra, but someone else too. Malini refuses to accept the news, overwhelmed by grief. Rao explains it was true fire in battle and that the priesthood is demanding war with Ahiranya. Malini, resigned to the burden of leadership, asks him to leave. She weeps, a primal, guttural cry, feeling the weight of her empire and its cost. Despite her grief, she resolves to face the coming war, hardened by sorrow, knowing that her true battle has only just begun. In Chapter 62, the men who survived the battle spread a tale of Aditya's heroic sacrifice, claiming he died for Empress Malini, burning with the mother's fire to cleanse the fortress. Rao, unable to remember any details of Aditya's death, is haunted by grief and guilt. As he processes the loss of Aditya and Chandra, he drowns his sorrows in alcohol. Learning that Malini seized her throne before the siege, Rao's grief deepens. Alone in a corner, he is approached by Lada, who asks about Aditya's final moments. Rao bitterly questions the worth of everything, feeling nothing matters anymore. Lada shares her concern for Seema, left behind by Priya, and asks Rao to protect her. Reluctantly, Rao agrees, though he confesses he doesn't want to care about anyone else. As he reflects on his past with Aditya, he is reminded of their shared memories and Aditya's dreams for the future. Epilogue. Priya reflects on her actions and the choices she made, wondering if leaving answers for Malini would have been better. She acknowledges her pain and guilt, but believes that hating her is the only way for Malini to survive. Priya walks alone, feeling like a heartbroken failure, unsure of Malini's fate, but aware that flowers grow wherever she steps. She recognizes that she has hollowed herself out for the Yaksa, who have named her their priestess. Priya struggles with overwhelming loneliness and isolation, reaching out through the Sangam but finding nothing. Eventually, she arrives at the edges of Ahiranya, feeling the pull of the land. There, she encounters a stranger, Ashok, whose appearance is strikingly familiar but different. He welcomes her with a solemn greeting, calling her sister, leaving Priya to wonder what has become of him.